Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to pull back the curtain on an incredible story about how one powerful family, a single best-selling book, and a very savvy lobbying effort helped push America into the Second World War.
So, how does a group of Protestant missionaries end up helping to kickstart a world war? Sounds kind of crazy, right? But let's get into it because this is a wild story about how this one powerful interest group with roots in religious missions played a huge role in dragging the U.S. into World War II and, in the process, really set the stage for the entire Cold War.
All right, so where does a story like this even begin? Well, it's not with some famous politician or a general. Our story actually starts with one young guy, a man named Charlie Song, and his completely improbable journey to becoming a genuine kingmaker.
I mean, just stop and think about this journey for a second. This kid, Sung, he shows up in the U.S. when he's 15 with basically nothing, a laborer. But he gets taken under the wing of these powerful Southern Methodists. We're talking people like the Tobacco King, Julian Carr. He ends up going to college, gets a theology degree, and then goes back to China, makes a fortune printing Bibles of all things, and then he starts bankrolling a revolution. It is an absolutely incredible story.
But here's the thing. Charlie Song's real, lasting influence wasn't actually his money. It was his kids. See, they were all educated in America, which put them in this perfect position to move between two totally different worlds like nobody else could.
So after Charlie dies, it's his eldest daughter, Ailing Sung, who really steps up and takes charge of the whole family empire. And when this rising military star, a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, starts to take over the nationalists, Ailing sees her moment. She doesn't just see a potential ally. No, she sees the centerpiece for building an actual dynasty.
Okay, so just look at this slide. This is where you can see Ailing's absolute genius for power politics laid out. It was, for all intents and purposes, a complete takeover. She gets Chiang to make her husband the prime minister. Boom, political control. She gets her brother appointed as the finance minister. Boom, financial control. And then the masterstroke. She marries off her younger sister, the American-educated Mei-ling, directly to Chiang himself. It's a complete merger of their family's money with his political and military power.
And with all that Song family power now behind him, what's the first thing Chiang does? In April of 1927, he turns on his rivals, Mao Zedong and the Communists, in what becomes known as the Shanghai Massacre. Now, we're not talking about a simple political purge here. This was a brutal, bloody move to consolidate power. Tens of thousands of people were killed, and it was the spark that lit the fire of a civil war that would go on to define China for the next 100 years.
So they've got China locked down through force, but the Sungqian alliance knew that wasn't enough. They needed to win over a much bigger prize, the most important audience of all, the American public. And what they do next, well, it's a masterclass in how a foreign interest can shape American foreign policy from the inside out.
They put together this incredible propaganda machine, seriously unlike anything America had ever seen for a foreign power. You had Mei-ling Song as the perfect public face for it, charming, Christian, American-educated. You had the media giant Henry Luce, who used his whole empire, Time, Life, Fortune magazines, as their personal megaphone. And then you had this storyteller, an author named Pearl Buck, who wrote the one book that would completely capture the hearts and minds of America.
And we really can't overstate this. Pearl Buck's novel, The Good Earth, wasn't just some popular book. It was a full-blown cultural phenomenon. It was the #1 bestseller for 2 years straight, it won a Pulitzer Prize, and for millions of Americans who knew basically nothing about China, this became their entire understanding of the country. It created this powerful, idealized image of a struggling, heroic, noble people.
And this right here, this is the heart of the whole campaign. It's the big deception. On the one hand, you have the myth they were selling to the American people, these heroic Chinese nationalists fighting a desperate battle for freedom against the Japanese invaders. But the reality, the truth on the ground was that Chiang was actually holding back his best troops. He was deliberately avoiding major fights with Japan because he was saving his army for the enemy he really cared about defeating, Mao and the Communists.
And just listen to this quote from Henry Luce, the media titan. This is so important. He wasn't just reporting the news about a distant conflict. He framed the whole thing as this grand moral crusade. He basically transformed China's internal conflict into a global battle for democracy, and he made it sound like it was America's sacred duty to get involved. So this story they were selling, it wasn't just for the average person reading a magazine at home. No. This narrative found a very friendly and receptive audience right inside Franklin Roosevelt's administration, and it started to create this massive split over what America's foreign policy should be.
And the perfect audience for this story was this incredibly powerful group within the administration, a group that historians now call the Wise Men. You can think of them as the ultimate internationalists. These guys believed it was America's job, its destiny, to use its power to run the world. So when the China lobby came along with this story of fighting for democracy, well, it fit their worldview perfectly. They bought it hook, line, and sinker, and they started pushing hard for a tough stance against Japan.
And this brings us to Chiang Kai-shek's real strategy, his long game. You see, it was never just about getting some planes or money from the US to help fight Japan. The ultimate goal was to get America to fight the war for him. The logic was pretty simple. Let the US military handle Japan and defeat them, and then he could finally turn his own untouched army around and wipe out Mao and the communists for good. Okay, so as Japan gets more and more aggressive in Asia, the wise men in Washington, who are being constantly pushed by the China lobby, they see their opening. This is their chance to force a showdown. And it all leads to one single, irreversible decision. Now, this timeline is so important because it shows you exactly how this all went down. It's the summer of 1941. President Roosevelt is out of the country in Europe. The Secretary of State, who is always a bit more cautious about these things, is on vacation. So who's left running the show in Washington? Dean Acheson and the other wise men, the same guys who had totally bought into the lobby's story. And they don't waste a second. They use some bureaucratic maneuvering to push through a total oil embargo against Japan. This was the one move their bosses had always refused to make because they knew it would almost certainly mean war.
And that was it. That was the point of no return. The idea that you could just cut off Japan's oil supply and they would somehow back down, it was a complete and catastrophic miscalculation. For a country like Japan, an island nation with no oil of its own, this wasn't just an economic sanction. It was an existential threat, a death sentence. From that moment on, war wasn't just likely, it was absolutely inevitable. And sure enough, a few months later, came the attack on Pearl Harbor.
So America goes to war, and America wins the war against Japan. But the China lobby's grand vision? It completely falls apart. Even with billions of dollars in U.S. aid, Chiang's government was so corrupt and unpopular that it just collapsed. Mao wins the Civil War in 1949. And back in the United States, the whole idea of the loss of China becomes this incredibly toxic political weapon. It helps fuel the McCarthy era, it kicks the Cold War into high gear, and it sets the country on a path that leads straight to the wars in Korea and eventually Vietnam.
So when you boil it all down, what's the big lesson here? It's just a stunning reminder of the power of a really good story. It shows how a well-crafted narrative can literally change the world, steering entire nations into conflict. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the powerful narratives being told right now that are quietly shaping our own world today?